Okay, so by the time this video gets uploaded, I will hopefully be hard at work on the next and final Alien Biospheres episode. I can only hope that progress is going well. I'm recording this well in advance of that, just so that I can get some content out in the meantime. It's not been that long since I've recorded the last episode, so nothing left to do except to thank the patrons once again, and then just crack back on. So after the last episode, I think we now have a pretty firm understanding as to how our adjectives are working. We've got most of the important stuff covered with that, and so now I think it's time for us to dive properly into the world of derivation. And derivation is one of my favorite parts of the entire conlanging process. I just find it really fun to find ways of turning words into other words and to come up with how new meanings would be extrapolated from older meanings, and to think about how the speakers would conceptualize the world and name things based on concepts that they're familiar with. That's all really fun stuff for me. And in fact, to start us off and to tie things in with the previous episode, I had a realization about this affix that turns a noun into an adjective. And that is that since it's functioning by and large as a sort of general simulative type thing, it can also basically serve as an associative plural. And an associative plural is basically an affix that you put on a noun to convey the meaning of this and other things like it, or everything to do with such and such. So like in Nakachti, for example, Nakachti has an associative plural affix, and using it you can take the word that means coin, which if you use the ordinary plural would just give you coins, but using the associative plural it means riches or wealth, because it's like coins and other valuable things. Or actually another one I really like in Nakachti is if you apply the associative plural to the word that means lightning, you get the meaning of thunderstorm, because it's like the lightning and everything that comes with it, the wind, the rain, the storm, all of that. Now in Nakachti, I specifically derived the associative plural from an old word that meant family, and you can see how that would happen, because like the family of something means it and everything that's related to it. But if you'll permit me to go on a brief tangent, I do find it interesting that both Tamil and Mongolian form their associative plurals in almost exactly the same way. They both involve reduplication, which again is not particularly surprising, since, saying the noun multiple times is a pretty surefire way to encode that there's more than one of it. But specifically, the way it works in Tamil, one example that I can just immediately think of off the top of my head, if you take the word buli, which means tiger, if you reduplicate the whole word, and then you replace the first syllable of the second utterance with ki, so you get buli kili, and that means something along the lines of tigers and other large predatory animals. Whereas in Mongolian, if you take a word like mori, which means horse, once again, the whole word gets reduplicated, and then the second instance of the word undergoes a vowel alternation. I'm actually not totally sure what the pattern is, but at least for this particular word, it's morimari, and that means horses and everything that's associated with horses. I always thought it was interesting that those two strategies are so similar to each other. I don't actually know if there's a word for that particular type of reduplication where one of the two elements is altered in some way, because we do have that in English to some limited extent. We've got phrases like itsy bitsy or teeny tiny, things like that. But in any case, for this language, we basically get an associative plural for free, because this affix here basically means like the thing that is like such and such. And that does actually fit quite nicely with this lexical source meaning form or shape. It's kind of like how in taxonomy, where the suffix form indicates like a wider level of classification. Like just off the top of my head, the genus name for chicken is gallus, which comes directly from the Latin word for chicken, but chickens are part of the wider group called the galliforms, literally the chicken-like birds. There's like chickens and other things to do with chickens. So that's a pretty logical extension for this suffix. Let's actually make a separate area for nominal derivation. Should probably bring these over there as well. So we've already got our true simulative, if you want to call it that, or just a way of turning a noun into a verb that means to act like such and such. We do need a word for to become at some point. And actually this affix here, that means to be familiar with such and such, we used that in the last episode to make a word that means a person who is familiar with animals, however you actually choose to translate that into English. But it occurs to me that the proto-form of the word was kua, which comes out in the modern language as this form kun. So we'd said in the last episode that this affix was basically just a Q followed by a long low vowel. But if this verb was actually suffixed on relatively early on in history, then it would undergo the same changes that led to this same root becoming this kva ending in this particular possessive classifier. And I do think it actually makes more sense for this root to affix early on, because the original meaning was to know, whereas by the modern language it's become more of a sense of to be able to. So I'm actually going to say that the suffix by this point is going to be kva, because I do love that cluster, and it means it doesn't look like a very obvious compound of whatever the noun is and to know, which means that the word for someone who knows about such and such, or someone who is knowledgeable in a particular field, would be that same affix plus the participle. So those were all affixes that we were already thinking about beforehand. So just thinking now about what other sorts of derivational basics we want to cover. I mean, there's obviously agent nouns, which we've got covered with our participle. Then there's patient nouns, which are the sort of expected objects of the verb. Basically, like, you take a verb, put an affix on it, and it means the thing that usually experiences or is the patient of this verb. So, like, for example, you take the verb to teach, put on this patientive affix, and you get a word that means lesson, something that is taught. It's also often useful to have an affix for the instrument with which a verb is carried out. Like, English doesn't really make a distinction between agent nouns and instrument nouns. Like, English uses the er suffix for both of those. And I'm trying to think of a situation in which it would be ambiguous whether it referred to a human agent or the instrument. And the only thing I can come up with at the moment is lawnmower. Because I think most of the time people would agree that the lawnmower is the machine that one uses to mow a lawn. But you can also describe the person who is mowing the lawn as a lawnmower, one who mows lawns. So you can totally get away with having the agent noun serve double duty and cover both of those bases, but it's sometimes useful to have a separate instrument affix. Also, an affix for a place where the verb happens. You take a verb that means to cook, put an affix on it to turn it into, like, kitchen or something, a place where cooking happens. Also, just an abstract affix, or just a general sort of verbal noun that means the quality or state of whatever the verb is. So, like, to die versus death. So those are the major ones for turning verbs into nouns. Now, I do think I have a tendency of just sticking to basically this set. I mean, I'll usually have other derivational affixes as well, but I very often include these 5 as very prominent affixes that are very sort of cleanly and neatly defined. So I'd like to try doing something a little bit different this time. How exactly, I'm not immediately sure. In addition to those, I really like having a morphological augmentative and diminutive, and very often I'll have multiple different kinds of augmentatives and diminutives. Like, I think Nakashti has 3 or 4 of each that have slightly different shades of meaning. Also, I'll very frequently have some sort of collective affix. You stick it on the noun and it means all of such and such. And in fact, while we're on this one, we do already have a word that means all, because that's one of the elements in our superlative and sublative constructions, this C prefix. So it would be very easy to say that this same word for all just gets stuck onto the beginning of any given noun and provides a collective sense. But again, I have done that many times before. so I kind of want to see if I can do something a little bit different this time. And then there's the issue of intensives, both for verbs and for adjectives. Now, I absolutely adore intensive verb forms. It just brings me endless joy to be able to take a verb like to run and just put one affix on it, and it now means to sprint, to do something to an extreme degree. But again, I have used verbal intensives quite a lot in my other languages, and in fact I've probably overused them because they're really not too common cross-linguistically. Like, they're in the Semitic languages. Hebrew has a separate conjugation specifically for intensives, and I don't know as much about Arabic, but as I recall, there are some verb forms that have separate intensives that may or may not also be related to causatives in some way. So, I don't know, I will have to think about how exactly I want to handle that. So, as it occurs to me in the moment, those are the sort of major derivational categories, at least the ones that I usually play around with. So I have to think how I'm going to carve this up in a way that is different from my other languages, in a new and interesting direction. Well, first of all, I think I want to start with the augmentative, because this is one that I have actually had some thoughts about before this point. Because both for the augmentative and the diminutive, I can foresee two possible pathways. One is that there is some noun or adjective that is modifying another noun, and since it's modifying it, it will come beforehand, since this language is prototypically head final. And then the modifying noun will eventually shorten up and become a prefix. So for the augmentative, we could have some word that means like super, or giant, or even something like monster. That's actually kind of a fun one that I did in Okolawak, because in Okolawak there is no, at least I don't think there's any single morphological augmentative. Again, I was actively trying to do something different to what I usually do. But one of the ways you can get across an augmentative-like meaning is to use the word chazwai, which is the name of a particular prominent mythological creature. It fills a kind of similar niche to like a dragon in Okalayo culture. Big, scary, powerful, mythic monster. So you use the word chazwai in a possessive construction. So like if you say a word like fish, obviously on its own it's just a regular fish. But if it's the chazwai's fish, or the fish of the chazwai, or a chazwai-like fish, then that means it's like a sea monster, or some really big, impressive, or scary fish. So we could do a similar kind of thing here and have a word that means monster become a prefix, to get like a monster fish. Alternatively, we could have the opposite thing happen, and say that the word for monster or giant or what have you is actually the head of the phrase, that the augmented noun is actually interpreted as modifying. So it would actually be like fish monster, and that would have the effect of giving us a suffix. Now, as I say, I have had some idle thoughts about this before this point, but in terms of phonological form for this affix, I think with my other languages I have tended to overly rely on sound symbolism. Because, it's a pretty common sound symbolism that things that are big will have low vowels like ah and o, whereas things that are smaller will have front or more closed vowels like e and e. And while that is a broad tendency, it's definitely not a 100% rule. I mean, if you look at English, the word big and the word small show the complete opposite pattern. So I'd like to go against that principle this time round. So I was thinking of having a form of something like ika, and I'm specifically envisioning that as a suffix. Again, we could potentially have multiple different augmentatives with subtly different meanings, so we could still have some sort of prefixal augmentative if we wanted to. So if it is a suffix, then it will be treated as the stem for the purposes of determining declension, etc. So I think the protoform ikahi should get us what we want, because having that final vowel be long will mean that it will receive the stress when case marking is added, which means it'll pretty much always have that geminate K. And since the final vowel is a long I, according to the declension patterns we discussed last time, that'll give us an unspecified high vowel in the human class, an unspecified low vowel in the animate class, and a short I in the inanimate class. So as a proof of concept, if we take this word vahar, that means lizard, and we stick this augmentative on it, the augmentative would have to take the animate class marker, and then since the stress would ultimately fall on the closed penult, that vowel would disappear between the H and the R, and the final vowel would harmonize with the A and the stem to give us vahrika, which I think sounds lovely, and in terms of meaning, it could just be used to refer to a large lizard, like maybe a monitor lizard or something, or, and I think I'm going to go with this option, a crocodile, or just crocodilians in general. Or it could mean both. It could encompass both crocodiles and large lizards. Because one thing that I sometimes come across in conlangs, and I've actually been guilty of myself at various points, is that when coming up with names for animals, I think sometimes people tend to be a little bit overly scientific, because with a modern understanding of taxonomy, it's pretty obvious how different groups of animals are related to each other, but that's not necessarily going to be obvious to a pre-scientific, or not even necessarily pre-scientific, but just older culture, just depending on what types of animals are around in their home territory. Like, I might be confabulating this example, but I think in the Inuit languages, there's a basic root nanuk, which means polar bear, and all other bears are described as being types of polar bear. Whereas in languages from lower latitudes, it's usually the opposite. The polar bear is usually described as a type of regular bear, for lack of a better term. Or like if you look at medieval manuscripts, very often insects are described as being birds, because they both fly. Or how in a lot of Germanic languages the word worm can mean both actual worms and snakes, just because they're kind of long, thin things. Or in Mandarin, how the word for panda is shongmao, which literally means bear cat. Or a really weird one that I still don't get at all, the Mandarin word for snail is wenyo, which means shell cow. I have no idea how snails got conflated with cows, but just goes to show you can be very flexible with this stuff. So for what it's worth, this particular culture that speaks Takvamir, they are originally from a sort of subarctic climate, so they would not be exposed to very many reptilians. However, during the quote-unquote modern or present time period, they have ventured further south and encountered more tropical areas, so they're going to be exposed to a lot of different types of plants and animals that they'll have never seen before. So I think it's perfectly reasonable to say that they come across crocodilians for the first time and they think it's a giant lizard. So yeah, vahrika for crocodile. Very good. And since we're using crocodile as our prototypical example of this augmentative, I think the monster etymology does make some sense. And that is actually one thing that I haven't really done before, because sometimes in some languages, the augmentative can have a sort of negative connotation as something that's not only big, but it's also dangerous. I haven't really explored that very much in previous languages. Like in the Thracian languages, the augmentative has a generally kind of neutral sense of just being big or great. So this particular augmentative could have a specific meaning of like being scary, whereas we could potentially have another non-scary augmentative. Just like how in Nahuatl, the diminutive, which is tsin, is also the honorific, which in and of itself is very interesting. But there is another diminutive, ton, that is also diminutive, but it lacks the honorific sense. It just means small thing. Now, as for the diminutive, one pretty common source for the diminutive is the word child, which we already have. It's this word nila. But the issue is that I don't really see how that could reduce very much more. So it would end up basically just looking exactly like a compound. Well, I mean, I guess the first question is, do I actually want a diminutive? And my immediate thought is yes, because I find diminutives very useful and very cool to have. But I'd rather do something more interesting than just have a general diminutive thing. Well, I guess the different sort of senses that diminutives can have, obviously the most general sense is just a small thing, but it can also function as a partitive, or I believe the fancy name for it is meronymic, which specifically means a smaller piece from a larger whole. and that sometimes contrasts with a holonymic, which is the opposite. It's a larger whole that is formed from smaller components. So like Nakachti has both a meronymic and holonymic. So if I'm remembering correctly, if you take the word for bug or arthropod, because insects don't exist in the refugium, if you put the word for bug in the holonymic, that makes a word that means hive or swarm, because there's like a larger collective whole of bugs, which actually, thinking about it, is veering pretty close to collective territory, but Nakachti has both a holonymic and a collective anyway. But then if you take that same word for swarm and put it in the meronymic, it means an individual member of a swarm or a hive. And that actually makes me think of another affix that I had in Adun, which I don't think I ever came up with some fancy name for it, but it basically means the product or result of such and such. And I quite like this one because it comes from an old word for fruit, so the construction is literally the fruit of something, which is pretty similar to, in English, like the fruits of one's labour. So if you take a verb like to burn and stick this affix on, you get ashes. It's like the results or product of a burning. And that kind of overlaps with the meronymic in some ways. And then thinking specifically about how the augmentative sometimes has this overtone of being scary or dangerous. The diminutive very often has this sense of cuteness, but it's also totally possible for there to be a separate pejorative affix that just means that the thing is in some way not good. Like both Nakachti and Adun have a pejorative prefix. It's chi in Nakachti and chi in Adun. Or is it pejorative in Adun? That actually might just be the standard diminutive in Adun, and it only became pejorative on the way to Nakachti. I can't remember. In any case, the question is, if we have a diminutive, which we probably will, how many of these senses do we want it to encompass? So I do like the idea of an affix that conveys both this partitive meronymic sense, but also this sort of resultative product of sense as well. Because in the past, I have had a bad habit of making a separate affix for every single possible sense that I can think of. So I'm trying to sort of combine these in some way. So let's go ahead and just say that we'll call it a meronymic / resultative for now. I think that, as always, the lexical source for this affix is really going to determine how it ends up getting used and is going to be most informative about what its interpretation is. So what's a good lexical source for this? Again, my immediate thought is child, because child fits both of these senses pretty well, but we do already have a word for child. So either we think of a different lexical source, or we say that the word for child used to mean something else, and that this was the original word for child that has become an affix. I mean, if we went with baby, that would have a very prototypical diminutive sort of meaning. And at that point, I'd kind of be slightly concerned that it would have all of these senses baked into one. Yeah, for now I think I'm going to go with child. It just fits too well. And as for the word that we have that already means child, we could differentiate them by saying that one of them, probably this one, had the specific meaning of son or daughter of, rather than just being, a general young person. Because that specific meaning of being born from, or the progeny of, such and such is kind of what gives it this meronymic / resultative meaning. So I'll actually just rough that in as son or daughter. Don't know if that word will actually end up being gender neutral, but we'll get to that when we get to it. Looking at the various different possible forms for affixes that I've been jotting down, I think I'm going to go with this bir suffix. So the protoform would have to be something like biri, or in fact, basically any sibilant in there should be fine, because they all roticize anyway. Now that we've worked out this pattern for the declensions based on the final vowel, I'm very cognizant of that. If the stem did end with an I, then that I would, in the human singular, merge with the W, so it would actually come out as biri. But I'd kind of like to have a final R if possible. It does actually occur to me this could be a reasonably common affix in people's names, because if it's the word for son or daughter, it might be like the son suffix in English. Well, I did decide that for stems ending with a U, in the human singular, the W just melds straight into the U, which means that the vowel gets lost later. So that would, in fact, give us beer without any final vowel, whereas in the animate it would have a low vowel, and in the inanimate it would have an unspecified high vowel. Okay, that's one affix that could have a sort of diminutive sense to it. I'm actually going to hold off for now on making another diminutive, just because I'm not even 100% sure that'll be necessary now that we have this one. And we'll come back to it. Okay, so looking back at our potential derivational strategies, I realize one that I forgot is a way of turning adjectives into abstract nouns. Because by the nature of our adjectives, we can already use them as nouns in their own right, but specifically to get across the sense of what is essentially the ness suffix in English. So if you take a word like strong and use it on its own, it would mean a strong one or a strong thing, but we'll need a way of getting across the meaning of strength specifically. So for something like that, we would need a lexical source of something along the lines of state or quality or condition or something like that. So like the state or quality of being strong. And I'm thinking about how cross-linguistically it's extremely common for states or qualities to be described in terms of location. Like the word state itself comes from a word that means to stand. And it also still survives into modern English as being like a province or a territory. So we could go for something like location, or position, or even just place, honestly. Which makes me think about this affix down here. If we had an affix for the place of something, could that fill this same function? So like if it goes on a noun or a verb, it means the place of such and such. But if it goes on an adjective, it means ness, the quality of being such and such. Yeah, that's a weird one, but I kind of like it. It reminds me a bit of how in Nahuatl, what is essentially the affix for this ness meaning, the abstract nominal ending, is also the ending that's used to mark inalienable possession. So if you take a word like maitl, which means hand, and put a first-person possessive marker on it, you get noma, which means my hand, but that implies alienable possession, whereas to say my own hand, the one that is actually part of my own body, you would put the abstract ending on to get nomaio. So it's like my handness, the state of being my hand. I always thought that was really fun, so this is kind of like that. The only downside I can think of to that is that we wouldn't have a way of turning an adjective into a place. Like we couldn't just take an adjective like good and stick this ending on it to make the good place. It would always just mean goodness, which would mean that we'd either have to resort to just straight up compounding, or there would have to be another affix that also means place of, and at that point that might get a little bit clunky. You know, thinking about it now, I have actually kind of been treating this word duk, which means house, as kind of a place of suffix. Because since the beginning I've been imagining it as being a very common ending for at least buildings. Like Aikaduk is temple, which is god house, and I don't think I've actually written this one down yet, but just thinking about it now, we could have like Baraduk, which is strong house, which could be a word for like fortress. So we might as well make note of that. And as I recall, we did decide a couple of episodes back that in words like Aikaduk, that this duk element would have suffixed on before vowel harmony, would be duk with an underspecified high vowel, which completely coincidentally looks pretty much identical to the place of suffix in Adun. It's a little bit frustrating, but there's not much we can do about it now. And there are actually a couple of other nouns that I've been treating in a vaguely similar way, like the word gallo, which means animal or beast, as in vaharkallo, which means reptile or lizard beast, and qinkallo, which means sea creature. So we're basically treating this like a derivational affix as well. Kind of reminds me of the lan suffix in Turkish, which is used to derive the names of various large animals. Like the word for lion is aslan, which is where C.S. Lewis got the name Aslan for the Narnia books. And there's also kaplan, which means tiger, and there's probably some others that I just can't think of at the moment. And there's also this word vad, which has a very general meaning of land or place. So that already gives us two different possible affixes for a meaning of the place of such and such. Also, while this word in its independent form will begin with a V when that W undergoes fortition, if it's an affix then that won't happen, unless of course it's immediately following an obstruent. But otherwise, the W might just get swallowed up, so we just have an underspecified low vowel followed by a D. Now, this meaning of land of such and such makes me think that maybe this meronymic affix might also be used to describe a person from a particular nation or province or territory, to describe someone as like a child of such and such nation. Alternatively, we do have a word for to live or dwell in, so we could make another verbal affix, where by incorporating the noun into the verb for to live, you get a meaning of to live in such and such. Although I am mindful of potentially overusing the participle ending, because the long vowel in the participle means that a lot of these verbal endings are going to come out sounding pretty similar, as we've already seen with the similative/privative, and the only difference between them is one consonant. So if we didn't want to do that, we could do it the old-fashioned way, and just put the verb into the different noun classes. So that's the old word for to live. In the human class, it would be wichtig, with the proviso that that initial V, again, would not actually fortify if this was being used as a suffix. In the animate class, it would be wachta, and in the inanimate, it would be wichtig. So if we say that this word got suffixed on sufficiently early in history, then I don't think we'd have any problem in saying that this W just gets swallowed up between vowels. So we'd get an affix that means the inhabitant of, and I guess we could say that these words stick around to the modern day, or we could say that by the modern period, the standard way of doing that is just to use the participle. I actually kind of like that. And I don't think that conflicts too much with the idea of this meronymic, because, for one thing, sometimes the senses of these different affixes can overlap, and I can foresee situations in which one would be preferred over the other. Well, that was a little bit of a sidetrack, but it was very useful. Still don't have a form for this ness ending, but that'll have to wait until next time. For now, I've got just enough time to coin another adjective, and then a final example sentence. So I'm thinking about potential meanings for a basic adjective, and very often, even in languages with a very limited adjective class, colour terms are very likely to be included as part of the sort of core adjective set. Now, colour terms are a whole separate kettle of fish that we'll have to talk about at some other point. But regardless of how we handle that, I think it is pretty certain that this language is going to have a word for black or dark, because that's usually like the most prototypical split in terms of colours is between black and white. If the language has any colour terms at all, those two are guaranteed. So what's a good term for black? I'm thinking something like sirda, and of course that final vowel will determine the declension. Let's just make it a U for now. Okay, there's every possible combination of case and gender morphology. Now, completely unintentionally, just like this word rihe that meant fast, we have a neutral vowel in the stem, so we're liable to see some more variation than usual in these suffixes. And I think those would be all the forms for it. And as a result of that neutral vowel, we still get a difference in form between all three genders, whereas if we didn't have a neutral vowel in the stem, then the human and inanimate would have the same vowel. Okay, and now an example sentence. Something that makes use of what we've done today. I want to use this inhabitant of suffix, and maybe also the meronymic suffix. Well, we do have this word for city, which could fit either one or both of those meanings. We take the word for tree, so tree with the inhabitant suffix could mean like tree-dwelling or arboreal, whereas city, we could also apply the inhabitant suffix to make city-dweller, but if we use the meronymic, then that would be like a citizen, one who comes from the city, even if they're not necessarily living in the city right now. Then we have the augmentative. We've already coined the word vahrika, so we could just use that. I guess tree could also work with this affix for land. So like a tree land would be like a woodland, an area of forest, but I don't want to use tree twice. Do have a word for river though, so riverland. We might as well use the adjective we just coined. While the citizen, and let's make it plural because I tend to underuse plurals, while the citizens walk in the riverland, black crocodiles hunt the fast, tree-dwelling creatures. And just for the hell of it, let's make it habitual, because we haven't used one of those in a while. So it's just sort of a general truth that when citizens go walking in the riverlands, the black crocodiles hunt the fast, tree-dwelling creatures. It's just the sort of standard state of affairs. Okay, so we've got two different clauses here. We'll do the first one first, because it's easier. The verb is walk, and since this is just a converb clause with no finite verb, all we need is the first principal part. So that's while walking. Citizens. Well, city is imre, and with this inhabitant of suffix, I realised that I did not actually fully decline it, so we have not actually worked out what the plural is yet, but that's pretty straightforward. With the human plural ending, that I would take over the suffix, so the ending would be ir, so citizen therefore would be imrechtir. Now, does that long I in the final syllable actually cause umlaut? If that suffix predates umlaut, which it may well do, I'd need to think about that, but I'm just going to leave it as it is for now. Okay, then we need in the riverland. So river is baske, and then land in the locative is the same as it is in the nominative, which is vad, but since this is being suffixed, the W would never fortify, so we'd get baskad. Now we could technically leave it like that, but it feels a little bit empty without a postposition there. I'm just going to throw in this word that means in or inside, which coincidentally actually comes from the same root as our inhabitant of suffix. Okay, so that's while the citizens walk in the riverland. Okay, then the second clause, we need the verb to hunt in the habitual. The habitual is form 1 combined with the second principal part. I've just realised I misremembered we don't actually have a word for to hunt. We have this word for to gather that comes from an old word that means to hunt. But I guess that'll work just as well. So that's the second principal part. Okay, form 1 of the auxiliary. You know what? Let's just throw in a potential for the hell of it. The black crocodiles might hunt the fast tree-dwelling creatures. Okay, then we need crocodiles. So the singular is vahrika, and the plural, again, I didn't actually bother declining the full form, but I'm pretty sure that would come out as vahrikas. Then we need the word black, which agrees with the nominative plural. Okay, then tree-dwelling creatures. So tree is osto. I've just realised that I've got my affixes mixed up. I gave the inhabitant suffix to the citizens, which again, totally viable as a strategy, but I was actually going to use that one for tree and use the meronymic for city. So let's switch those around. First of all, for city, it would be bir, but because that B is intervocalic, it would become a V, and in the plural, adding the R plural ending, the R would have to turn into an L because of liquid dissimilation. Whereas for the tree, put on the inhabitant suffix, and then it needs the animate plural accusative ending. The animate plural would just be is, and the accusative would be s on top of that. So that's tree dwellers, specifically tree-dwelling animals. And then finally, the tree-dwelling animals are fast. Animate plural accusative. Okay, I think that's the whole thing. In which case we would get Imruchviral baskad vetnikin, sirdus verrikas de circuricussi ostochtis kaskar. Okay, and that is going to be it for today. I'm almost certainly going to get at least one more of these recorded, probably within the next week or two. As for when I'll actually upload them, I do not yet know, but wherever you are in space or time, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.